Portal with RTX is here, and it is an absolute triumph, and I am on the case to cover its path trace goodness for Digital Foundry. In today's video, I will look into Portal with RTX to show off how it looks. I will also compare it to the original Portal, and I will talk about performance scaling a bit. But before I get into any of that, it must be said again, Portal with RTX is an absolute triumph, and not just for its masterful use of lighting and cutting-edge technology, but also because of how it functions, which will kind of sound like black magic when I describe it to you just now. Portal with RTX is essentially built on the backbone of RTX Remix, which, as you can see in this diagram here from NVIDIA, takes an old game that has a fixed function rendering path. That means an older game that supports graphics hardware that lacks pixel shaders, like this venerable GeForce 2 MX I have right here. Fixed function graphics like you see here on the left in Halo Combat Evolved's PC port lack the shiny visuals that are made with pixel shaders and the like, but it still has basic lighting and multi-texturing. Well, RTX Remix takes this ugly rendering path you see on the left here and replaces all of the graphics that are done via rasterization with full-on path tracing. It also generates motion vectors on the geometry and more to enable the use of TAA, DLSS, and even per-object motion blur, like we can see here on this cube flying through the pipe in Portal with RTX. With the rendering replaced, modders and artists can go in to override lights. They can replace assets with newly created one. Textures can be made or remade in any way you see fit and make them physically based, and so on and so forth. RTX Remix is an entire system for replacing a game's visuals with path trace ones that lives entirely outside the game's awareness and gameplay code. It is honestly astounding that this works at all, and Portal RTX is essentially the showcase that shows what Remix can do when time is invested in making new assets and tailoring each and every area of the game to work with the new rendering and lighting paradigm. And that new rendering paradigm is path tracing, which needs a bit of an explanation. Path tracing describes the process of tracing the path of light. You can think of it as a much more total and comprehensive version of ray tracing we see in today's games. Games today are done with hybrid ray tracing usually. For example, Spider-Man Remastered that I recently talked about on the channel. In that game, all of the primary rendering, or primary visibility as it's called, where there's no concept of lighting at all, is essentially done with rasterization. On top of this, there are other rasterization techniques like N.L direct lighting, shadow maps for opaque things, and probe-based indirect lighting, to give a little bit of green bounce light to Spider-Man here. All loose approximations for the real phenomenon that is lighting. But some of the world's reflections are done via ray tracing, and the world and the characters in that reflection have degraded shading, shadows, and lighting than even the primary visible world to keep things cheap on the rendering side. That's why when you look at reflections in a game like Spider-Man Remastered, you can see that there's a lot of compromises to the lighting, reflections, shadows, geometry detail, global illumination, and much more in those reflected surfaces. In something path traced like Portal with RTX, it is quite different. All the primary rendering, or primary visibility as it is called, done with ray tracing. So that makes it more expensive just to render from the start. But it has its advantages while being more expensive. For example, if you look through glass, path tracing allows those primary visibility rays to refract through the glass, giving you that glassy look that you really expect coming from real life. Another advantage in Portal is that primary visibility rays can go through Portal surfaces and shade normally on the other side. In the original game, each portal that is visible re-renders the entire world from that portal perspective in degrading quality with each portal that it goes through. So you can see a low-res, grainy look in distant portals, while in the path tracing view, the quality of the visuals in each portal and their resolution stays the exact same. On top of the primary visibility being done with ray tracing, all of the direct lighting and shadowing and direct reflections are done via ray tracing as well. In comparison to the original Portal, this offers huge benefits to the game, as the original source engine used here in Portal from 2007 really doesn't have any concept of real-time dynamic direct lighting. Nearly all of the lighting in the game is static. So now you have real moving direct shadows that project from the proper source and angle. You have particles being lit directly by the environment around them, which otherwise were just unlit and rather strange looking in the original Portal. You also get the really cool added effect of portals transmitting direct lighting and more directly through the portal surface. So you can see light seeping through portals from the lighting on the other side, something not at all really possible in the original rasterized lighting or in rasterization in general. You also get direct emissive lighting from any of the surfaces in the game that would brighten up in the original to be full bright, but they didn't actually emit any light from their surface. While now in the path tracing view, they do. You can see these little inlaid lines, for example, along steps or stairs or along the floor that now light up the environment around them with an orange glow. Or you have the various waypoint markers in the world that change color. In the original, they would just change color on their surface in a full bright way, but now they also emit light to the area around them, and dynamically, which gives the game an entirely different look, where it kind of looked weirdly static beforehand. And just when you thought that might be enough, well, path tracing actually keeps on going, as all of the indirect lighting on top of the direct lighting is also done via ray tracing, and not just one bounce. On the ultra settings, each ray bounces 4 times around the scene, giving a very complete global illumination look to the entire world. This is why reflections in Portal, for example, like we're seeing here, looking in this transparent pipe, look much more detailed in terms of lighting and shadowing and global illumination than we see in hybrid ray-traced games. There are many bounces of light occurring, and reflections are shaded in a much more realistic manner. This is also why Portal RTX can look quite a bit different at times than the original Portal, as this global illumination is affecting both diffuse and specular lighting. Diffuse lighting means all those kind of rougher surfaces, and the original Portal actually, with its light mapping, had static objects bounce light around the scene, and so you could see diffuse lighting bouncing around the scene in the original Portal in a static way. That also happens in Portal RTX, of course, which is why a number of scenes look extremely similar when you put them side by side. Both are bouncing light along diffuse surfaces in a very similar way. But when you get to specular surfaces, as in those with reflections on them, that's where Portal RTX is going to look a lot different than the original Portal. The original Portal and Source Engine has very limited specular lighting, so things that are reflective reflect in a very basic and simple way. Take this wall here, for example. In the original game, there's some sort of semblance of a cube map that moves with the camera when you look at this reflective wall right here. It doesn't really make any sense given the geometry or lighting of the rest of the room, but it's just what had to be done back in those days to save on processing power and video memory. With path tracing, that reflection we're seeing on that metallic surface is actually representative of the scene around it and the light in that scene and the surfaces as well. So that's why this wall looks particularly different in the new Portal RTX. It's actually reflecting the world around it. Same with the floor in that exact same scene. Some weird specularity that doesn't really make too much sense given the rest of the lighting of the scene around it in the original game, but in the new game, all those reflections are ray traced multiple times over, so that's why this surface looks rather different. That is why a number of scenes in Portal RTX can look different from a quote-unquote artistic perspective. That's because specular light is now actually bouncing around the scene, whereas the original, you would just have static cube maps that would maybe move with the camera in a really strange way, whereas now such metallic surfaces are actually reflecting the world around them. That gives those metallic surfaces a different look than the original game. Tying together this new lighting are new assets for textures and geometry that fill out the game world. and this difference is huge on any close inspection. Assets which were originally limited by the design constraints of GPUs circa 2005 now have incredibly detailed surfaces, and things which were once just textures are now fully 3D models in their own right often enough. Just showing all these side-by-sides that I've prepared should give you a sense of what I mean here. Portal was not exactly a cutting-edge game in regards to texture or geometric quality when it came out in 2007, but now I think it rivals modern releases in terms of materials and geometry. I'm particularly fond of how things like this fence here now have individual wires modeled out, something I also recently saw in the Unreal Engine 5 demo for Matrix Awakens. But now we're getting this level of detail in Portal, which is just mind-blowing. Here there is also technically a small break from the original Portal's aesthetic in regards to one asset, and that is the generic floor texture. The original game had a generic floor texture, which is a concrete-looking one that is a fully diffused texture with no apparent normal map or specular. In the new game, there's a texture that is rather diffuse, but it has a stippled surface, and it is more akin to what we see in Portal 2, if you've ever played that. So it's a mix of Portal 1 and 2 here. I was curious about this, so I asked some sources that worked on the project, and apparently it was not an arbitrary decision to include this Portal 2-like artwork in Portal 1, as the game's art direction, including material choices, was not something that NVIDIA decided upon arbitrarily. Rather, there was a collaboration with Valve, and there were multiple reasons behind the decisions here for the art. So this is intended by the developers, but it is still proven bizarrely controversial, so if you do not like it or any of the other changes here, well, you can always replace the texture yourself should you so wish, or you can always disable newer assets in the game options, which are accessible by hitting Alt+X. In sum though, I think Portal with RTX is just fantastic. The new lighting model breathes life into an old game, which I would have never otherwise revisited honestly. And it made me appreciate Portal even more, as it was no longer shackled by some of Source's weird technical constraints, especially regarding dynamic lighting. And I think that is what RTX Remix will do when it releases in full. Even with it not being out already, people across the internet have been adding in Portal RTX's remix files into games like Max Payne, SWAT 4, and even more. Even without any tweaking and the materials just being the default ones, RTX Remix is already working magic in those games. And when RTX Remix comes out, it will be even better. There's a ray tracing revolution just on our doorstep for remastering old games. But a ray tracing revolution for remastering old games actually requires those games to run at all on people's computers. And if you read commentary across social media, everyone seems to be under the impression that Portal RTX only runs on RTX 4000 series hardware. They're kind of right in one aspect, but also completely wrong. To play the game at its ultra settings at a higher resolution at 60 FPS or more definitely requires an RTX 4000 GPU. I played the game without DLSS 3 frame generation on an RTX 4090, and to hit 60 FPS consistently as in all the time, I had to play in 4K DLSS performance mode. So it required performance mode to be a completely consistent 60 FPS. That should tell you enough just how heavy this game is, even on an RTX 4090. But it makes sense. Portal on its ultra settings is doing some of the most intensive path tracing ever put into a video game. 4 raw bounces. No fallback structure for cheating essentially. Your GPU will be humbled by it, and it is honestly justified. But you can also make your PC more prepared to run it by changing the settings and using optimized ones, and also using a lower DLSS mode than you might be used to. For example, if you're on a higher end card, I have generated quote-unquote high optimized settings for you that you can see here. It is essentially a tweaked version of the game's high setting. That setting drops the max amount of path trace bounces to 2 and reduces denoiser quality, among other things. Looking at the lighting differences, they are not that big. With max 2 bounces, shadows are a little bit darker, and so are crevices that are further away from direct lights. For the denoiser, I had a hard time spotting differences usually with this one, but you can expect less stable reflection resolve on occasion, and fast-moving shadows will be less defined and potentially more noisy. Like I said though, my settings deviate from the high settings, as I recommend keeping volumetric lighting on, as it greatly enhances the atmosphere, keeping textures to ultra as well, and setting particle lighting to ultra, which offers obvious particle lighting at a minor performance cost. For older, lower end and pure line or or Turing GPUs, I have also made low optimized settings that you see here, which are the same as the ones on high, except you should set the max light bounces to 1, which once again makes those shadows a little bit darker, but the game will run much better with 1 bounce of GI, which is in fact similar to the amount of bounces GI found in Quake 2 RTX's high setting as well. Lastly, for optimized settings, I do recommend using a lower preset of DLSS than you might actually be used to, as lower modes of DLSS actually look pretty good in this game. For example, Ultra Performance mode at 4K is usually something I would say you could avoid, but it looks pretty good in Portal RTX. Seriously, shockingly good in comparison to how I'm used to seeing it looking. I would imagine lower modes of DLSS look better in Portal than in other games due to the game's clean art style and because the game has very little to no ultra thin transparent detail. To test these settings, I used one of the hardest to render test chambers in the game that you can see here. When doing so with the RTX 3080, I found it can run this heavy test chamber just about at 60 FPS with mild drops below 60 on these high optimized settings in 4K DLSS Ultra Performance mode. This would be rather excellent performance for a VRR display, and it is in fact light years better than the performance that you would have otherwise achieved on ultra settings with my usually recommended performance mode. At 1440p, the story is even better for the RTX 3080. Here the 3080 manages a rather good performance in DLSS performance mode even with ultra settings, but those of you looking for a locked 60 FPS in this scene and elsewhere in the game could just use my high optimized settings here. On the low end, I used an RTX 2060 Super in this test chamber at 1080p output, and as we can see on the far right, it's pretty obvious that ultra settings with my usually recommended quality mode for 1080p here is just far too much for this GPU to handle. But dropping to my high optimized settings and using DLSS performance mode, we can see in the second from the right video here that it runs a lot better. But still, there could be occasional dips below 30 FPS. This is where my low optimized settings come in here in the video that is second from the left, which clears up any issues completely, and the game would really never drop below 30 FPS at all here with these settings. And just for fun, on the far left, I ran the game with DLSS Ultra Performance mode 1080p and my low optimized settings, and what do you know? It runs at a cool 60 FPS in one of the heaviest chambers in the game. And I think that shows pretty well that Portal with RTX can run on many GPUs other than the latest RTX 4000 series. You just need to be a bit more realistic with your settings. As I say that though, I am only speaking of NVIDIA GPUs. Now, brace yourselves. This is how the game runs on AMD GPUs. As you can see, it's running incredibly, ridiculously, laughably poorly. Yes, AMD GPUs are not as good at ray tracing as their NVIDIA counterparts, and it would not surprise me if the 3080 was more than twice as fast in this title were it working, but even the 2060 Super here is performing 700% faster at these settings than the RX 6800 XT, and that means Portal with RTX is completely broken and not working correctly on AMD hardware. Given how the game doesn't even start on Intel GPUs, yeah, things definitely need changing here. A last thing that could use changing is DLSS 3. No matter what, with or without VSync, it never feels or looks smooth. The frame rate reproduced is high like it should be, but the camera motion is jittery and it rubber bands or stutters. I'm not sure how well this footage here on screen shows it off, but hopefully it does to you and to NVIDIA as well. With that being said, I have come to the end of this video. Portal with RTX is cool as heck, and RTX Remix looks to be foundational technology for the future of modding old games on PC. They just really need to make sure it works on GPUs that are not NVIDIA ones. But that is enough from me for now. If you did enjoy this video, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you're already a subscriber, hit that little bell in the corner to be informed as soon as Digital Foundry posts a video. If you want to help us out, support DF on Patreon to ensure more PC-focused vids like this in the future and get years of our content in high quality for download. Other than that, comment below, follow on Twitter, and as always, this is Alex, bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen.
Maybe you could settle for that and we'll just call it a day. I guess we both know that isn't going to happen. You chose this path. Now I have a surprise for you. Deploying surprise in 5, 4... Time out for a second.